American politics, the dog and pony show it's like fascinating, but it's not surprising, to be sure, but it's disgusting. It's the wag the dog kind of mentality that goes on over and over and over again. And the most recent iteration of it is this entire fiasco over the 9/11 families being able to sue foreign governments. It is the Justice Against States That Sponsor Terrorism Act, something like that. JASTA, I believe, is the acronym. I'll get it in a second. But so the long and short of it is Congress, in a rare show of bipartisanship, passed this piece of legislation unanimously, giving the families of 9/11 victims, or not just 9/11 specifically, but giving families the ability to sue governments that sponsor terrorism. Now, the immediate implications of it was the ability of 9/11 families to sue Saudi Arabia for their involvement or their funding of terrorism, of the 9/11 attacks. President Obama was clear from the very beginning that he was expressly against this. And the reason he said so was because of the implications that this has for sovereign immunity and our ability to operate in other nations. Our soldiers, our ambassadors, our statesmen and stateswomen, their ability to operate there with immunity. And that's something that's recognized in the international community, far-reaching. And so he promised that he would veto it. The House and the Senate passed it. President Obama vetoed it. As of yesterday, both the Senate and the House passed the legislation again with an overwhelming majority, overriding President Obama's veto. Now, you would think that was, and actually, before I go any further, I want you to hear President Obama's response to the override of the veto. Listen in.
Your reaction?
I think it was a mistake, and I understand why it happened. Obviously, all of us still carry the scars and trauma of 9/11. Nobody more than this 9/11 generation that's fought on our behalf in the aftermath of 9/11. And, those families deserve support and they deserve resources. That's why we set up a victims compensation fund, and on average, families received about $2 million each. But what this legislation did was it said if a private citizen that having been victimized by terrorism, that another country didn't do enough to stop one of its citizens, for example, in engaging in terrorism.
What else did it say, President Obama? Let's see.
Private lawsuit in court. And the problem with that is that
not quite sure what's wrong with the video, folks. Hold tight. The problem with that is what, President Obama?
Then our men and women in uniform around the world could potentially start seeing ourselves subject to reciprocal loss. And the concern that I've had has nothing to do with Saudi Arabia per se or my sympathy for 9/11 family.
Yeah, so here's the thing. So he expressed it pretty clearly, and he seems to make a compelling case. Here's the dog and pony show. On the screen, I have a picture of Chuck Schumer. This entire thing is one huge two-step. It's a what they call the Potomac two-step. It's a dance. It's a routine. Because of the amendment that Chuck Schumer had added to this legislation before they even passed it, before President Obama even vetoed it. Chuck Schumer essentially inserted into this legislation that ostensibly gives families of the victims of 9/11 the ability to sue foreign nations, particularly Saudi Arabia. He inserted into this legislation the fact that the Attorney General and the Secretary of State have the ability to prevent any type of action from going forward in perpetuity. In other words, they have the ability to step in and assert a stay, overriding any type of lawsuit for a period of 180 days. And then they have the ability to renew that stay for another 180 days. And they can continue to do that. In other words, if the U.S. government, the Attorney General, and the Secretary of State intervene and feel as though they should stop this lawsuit from going forward, a family member from suing a foreign government, the U.S. government has the ability to stop it. So the first question that comes to mind is if this was inserted before the first time it passed, that pretty much explains why it passed unanimously. But then two, why would President Obama even have the need to veto this if this was in the legislation? And three, why are these politicians acting as though they've done something so beneficial to the family victims of 9/11 when in reality all they've done is passed a law that said you can sue if you want to, but the Attorney General has the ability to stop you from going forward with that lawsuit? It's right there in the legislation. And what's fascinating to me the most, what's stunning, staggering, is the fact that no one is really talking about this. We got this from the New York Post, and I have not seen a corresponding article anywhere. The one place that I did see it was the New York Post. And I want to read you the excerpt from the actual legislation that gives the federal government the ability to prevent or to stall a lawsuit of a 9/11 victim, a family of the 9/11 victims suing a foreign government. And it's right there on your screen. Section 5, stay of actions pending state negotiation. First, they establish exclusive jurisdiction. The courts of the United States shall have exclusive jurisdiction in any action in which a foreign state is subject to the jurisdiction of a court of the United States. So first and foremost, the federal government is the boss in any of these lawsuits. Second, intervention. The Attorney General may intervene in any action in which a foreign state is subject to the jurisdiction of a court of the United States under Section 1605B of Title 28, the United States Code added, here's the part, for the purpose of seeking a stay of the civil action in whole or in part. But it gets better. Section C, the stay in general, a court of the U.S. of the United States may stay a proceeding against a foreign state if the Secretary of State certifies that the U.S. is engaged in good faith discussions with the foreign state defendant concerning the resolution of the claim against the foreign state or any other parties as to whom of claims is sought. Duration in general, a stay under this section may be granted for not more than 180 days. But just before you say, oh, it's just 180 days, they go one step further with an extension. In general, the Attorney General may petition the court for an extension of the stay for an additional 180-day periods, plural. So just as soon as you feel like this is a victory for the 9/11 victims, and politicians are gallivanting around the country pretending as though this is such a great victory for the 9/11 victims, this essentially is toothless. This has like absolutely no teeth because the federal government, the Attorney General, and the State Department has the ability to stop these actions for every 180 days. And the most amazing part is they've gone through this entire charade of pretending as though this is a huge action. This is our politicians with a resounding voice, a rare show of bipartisanship, standing up against President Obama to make sure that the victims of 9/11 and their families can seek restitution and from Saudi Arabia or any other government involved. But essentially they said, yes, you can go to court, But so long as the Attorney General can convince the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of State can certify that, we're talking to Saudi Arabia about this, we're gonna talk to them about it and get this resolved, then the Attorney General has the ability to stop and issue a stay of proceedings in this lawsuit. But still, the entire dog and pony show of President Obama vetoing a bill that is essentially meaningless in terms of filing a lawsuit. He vetoes it, and now the Congress comes back triumphantly to override the veto and saying, no, we want to make sure that our citizens have the right to sue foreign governments that sponsor terrorism, with the caveat of Section 5 that says the Attorney General can stop it dead in its tracks in perpetuity. Now, President Obama's justification for opposing this in the first place, that's the first part of it, is bad enough. The second part of this, actually, there's three parts of this. The second part actually is the fact that President Obama is concerned about our sovereign immunity. The fact that we want to be able to operate in other countries with impunity. And without this, if we step across this line, this is going to give foreign nations the ability, or not even foreign nations, this is going to give private citizens and individuals the ability to sue America for all of the crazy things that we do on the international stage. Here's a catch. Sovereign immunity exists because nations are sovereign. And I know that sounds redundant, but I need you to understand, even if a nation was sued by an individual, that nation cannot be forced by any court to actually pay or even recognize that lawsuit because they are sovereign. There is not even the International Court of Justice has the force of law. They have international law, they have treaties, they have regimes, they have norms. They have agreed upon norms. But if the United States wanted to ignore a lawsuit from somebody from, let's say, Yemen, we could ignore them and pretend like it doesn't even exist. Why? Because we're sovereign. So that's just kind of the international relations. Who's going to force the United States to comply to any of the actions, lawsuits from a foreign nation? Now, there are questions about the actions of the diplomats in those states and their ability to be immune and not be taken into custody. But those are extremes. We're talking about these lawsuits that President Obama is concerned. That's the one thing. The other thing is that there are nations right now that you have the ability to sue because of their involvement in terrorism. If those nations are state sponsors of terrorism, which is an official designation from the United States, you have the ability to sue them. Iran, Sudan, Syria, Libya at one time was on that list. But these are the nations that you right now have the ability to sue them. So it's not just a matter of sovereign immunity. It's a matter of our relationships with that sovereign. If we don't like that sovereign, or we identify that sovereign as being a sponsor of terrorism, then you can sue. But people who, let's say, just fund terrorism, or 19 of the hijackers coming from that nation, since we have good relations with that nation, we're not going to designate them as a sponsor of terrorism. Clearly, no. And then therefore, we are concerned with that example of sovereign immunity. But it gets worse. This is the case where American citizens are being prevented from suing foreign governments for death because of terrorism that they either sponsored directly or they did not prevent. And America is saying we're so concerned with our sovereignty that we cannot allow U.S. citizens who have been hurt by these nations to sue those nations, because if we sue those nations, then those nations might sue us. So if we were really concerned about that, then what about this provision in the TPP? Under the accord, companies and investors would be empowered to challenge regulations, rules, government actions and court rulings, federal, state, and local, before tribunals organized underneath the World Bank or the United Nations. This is from the article in the New York Times, the Trans-Pacific Partnership seen as a door for foreign suits against the U.S. by Jonathan Weissman. So, just so that we have the score, we are concerned about the sovereign immunity of a nation when it involves a U.S. citizen suing a nation that we're friendly with, even if they are connected to acts of terrorism. We're concerned about that sovereignty, but we are not concerned about the sovereignty that the TPP will violate by virtue of companies, corporations, and investors. We're willing to President Obama and everyone who has co-signed on this have been willing to subject voluntarily the United States to tribunals set up by the World Bank and the United Nations for the purposes of making sure that those corporations are not suffering any economic loss. And we're willing to allow the United States to go on trial over any regulations, any policies, any laws that we pass that may inhibit the profits, that may hurt the profits of these corporations. We voluntarily give over our sovereignty for corporations, for profit, but we're scared of relinquishing any sovereignty or the possibility of losing sovereignty because of our citizens suing nations involved with terrorism. Not only is this a dog and pony show because this legislation has no teeth, but it's also a slap in the face to let you know that your individual humanity is not as valued as corporations. Everybody wants to be a person. Corporations are people, my friend. Everybody wants to be a person until it's time to either pay taxes or till it's time to actually seek some repercussions, some reparations, something for the pain that a nation caused us. At that point, no. The most important thing is, are you incorporated?